Good morning. My name is Sun-Hyuk Kim, and I'm the Vice President for International Affairs here at Korea University, and I'm also Professor of Public Administration here. I will be a Master of Ceremony for today's special lecture by Mr. Eliasson, the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations. Before we begin, I would like to make a few logistic announcements. Please turn off your cell phones for the duration of the lecture. In addition, please refrain from taking digital photographs. There will be time at the end of the program to take photos, so do not take photos during the lecture, please. 잠깐 우리말로도 안내해 드리겠습니다. 우선 휴대전화를 무음으로 해주시고요. 그 사무부총장님 특강 동안 사진을 찍으시면 안 됩니다. 특강 끝나고 이제 질의응답 시간 일부에 사진을 찍으실 수 있는 시간을 지정해 드릴 테니까 그때 찍으시면 되고 지금은 찍지 말아주시기 바랍니다. Okay, I'd like to explain today's agenda. Today's agenda will include welcome remarks by Professor Jae-ho Yum, Korea University's president, followed by the lecture by our special guest, Mr. Eliasson. Afterwards, there will be an opportunity for questions and answers. We will end today's program by asking the Director of the United Nations Development Program, Seoul Policy Center, Ms. Anne-Marie Sloat-Carlson, to give some closing remarks. And now to begin, I'd like to call to the stage Professor Jae-ho Yum, President of Korea University, to officially welcome Mr. Eliasson to Korea University campus today. Let's welcome President Yum with a round of applause.
Ambassadors, Korean government officers, esteemed guests, faculty, staff, and students. It is my great pleasure and honor to welcome to Korea University our special guest lecturer, Mr. Eliasson, the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations. It is an honor for Korea University to host his visit in partnership with the United Nations Development Program Seoul Policy Center, whose office is located here at Korea University in the International Students Hall on our campus, and the Korean Government Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I'm certain that you will find Mr. Eliasson's lecture to be very timely and relevant, not only because it is being given during this 70th anniversary year since the chartering of the United Nations in 1945, but also because Mr. Eliasson will speak today on the topic of the new global landscape, challenges for the United Nations and its member states. As you know, South Korean government could not survive without the help of United Nations participation in the Korean Civil War. And also, you know that North Korea and South Korea both entered in the United Nations together. As we are all keenly aware, the United Nations task of navigating a path of international cooperation is an immense and ambitious project. Specifically, the issue of global conflict resolution and the peacekeeping have become not only increasingly urgent, but also more complex. The current political landscape can at best be described as a rich tapestry of competing economic, religious, and cultural values that represent the needs and concerns of humanity in different places and at different times. Navigating an international consensus to promote the path of peace, security, development, and human rights in this context is a very challenging endeavor indeed. And we are privileged today to receive an update on the current international situation from someone who is deeply aware of the difficulties involved in upholding these important fundamental foundational values against the forces that continue to foment distrust, hatred, terror, and war. You may just open the newspaper every morning and you can see a lot of this kind of problems and conflicts and terrors all over the world. And the United Nations really the sort of major player to resolve these kind of issues for the human prosperity and world peace. In addition to Mr. Eliasson's extensive work with the United Nations, having served as the president of the 60th session of the United Nations General Assembly, and as the first United Nations Under Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, being involved in operations in Africa and the Balkans, he has also had a prestigious career as a foreign minister and diplomat for his home country of Sweden. He's truly a man who has dedicated his life to working for the public good, locally, nationally, and internationally, especially in these days for the humanitarian issues. And in Korea, at the moment, not only the humanitarian issues, but also some kind of just an economic development for the developing countries or something like that. For these reasons, it gives me great pleasure, personally and professionally, to host Mr. Jan Eliasson's lecture today as he discusses the forces shaping change in today's world. At a time when international cooperation is so desperately needed, let us hope that his lecture today will help to inspire many of you, the next generation of business leaders, educators, government officers, and diplomats to continue this great work of seeking peace and harmony among peoples and nations. Especially, I just see a lot of Korea University, the undergraduate students and graduate students here today, and they just apply for the participating in this lecture. It is very, very sort of happy for me because Korea University is endeavoring to foster some kind of global leaders for the future. And we started almost a decade ago a new project that is Global KU project, and we foster our students to be more global and international leaders, especially for the world peace and human prosperity. Again, thank you very much for your coming, especially you visit Korea University and have a lecture today. Thank you.
I'll introduce you. Thank you very much, President Yam. And now, before I invite Mr. Jan Eliasson, Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, to the stage, I'd like to share with you his brief biographical information. President Yam already mentioned a lot of the information, so I will just briefly introduce to you. Prior to taking office as Deputy Secretary General on July the 1st, 2012, he had held a series of positions in the government of Sweden and the United Nations. He served as ambassador to UN, ambassador to US, and foreign minister of the Swedish government. And he was the special envoy of the UN Secretary General for Darfur and the first UN Under Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs. He also served as chair of Water Aid Sweden and a member of the UN Secretary General's Advocacy Group of the Millennium Development Goals. Mr. Jan Eliasson's talk today is entitled The New Global Landscape, Challenges for the United Nations and its Member States. Now please join me in welcoming Mr. Eliasson to deliver his lecture today.
Thank you very much for that brief introduction. Otherwise, it would have been a gentle reminder of my age. I thank you very warmly, Mr. President, Director Carlson, my dear friend Shamshad Akhtar, Executive Secretary of ESCAP, and faculty members, students. Great to be with you here. I'm back in Korea. I've been visiting Korea many times, both in the Swedish Foreign Service and as a UN official. I've had the honor of representing the United Nations at the inauguration of the President 2 years and 2 months ago. And before that, I visited Korea several times. Sweden, as you may know, has diplomatic relations with both Seoul and Pyongyang, and we have embassies in both places, and we have also officers in the DMZ, and the Neutral Nations Supervisory Commission. And I have been visiting these areas several times. During one of those visits, I met a very pleasant, very interesting, very intelligent Vice Minister of Korea by the name of Ban Ki-moon. And since then, our friendship has lasted to the degree that he asked me to join him as his deputy almost 3 years ago. I'm very glad to be at Korea University. The president and I spoke before we entered the room, and I'm impressed about the university's role in both the modernization of Korea and the democratization of Korea, and that the university has such a great percentage in foreign students, international students, and that you have a tradition of training, and I see them in front of me, a generation of civil public servants, international civil servants, I hope also. Our organization needs people like you. And of course, those who choose to work in civil society or the private sector. Because we need the international conscience, the international awareness on all levels. I would say that the strongest societies for the future will be those who can both keep their traditions, integrate their own culture, history, and traditions, deal with the past in a fruitful way, but also we need to have the international awareness, and I think the strongest nations will be those who can combine the two. I had the honor of giving a speech at the National Day in Sweden last June, and the theme of my speech was Sweden in the world, and the world in Sweden. In other words, all our nations today are part of the world, but the world is also inside our own nations. And that awareness is an historic necessity if we are to go in the direction of a more peaceful society. So I commend the university, I commend the Korean people, I commend the Korean government, which has become such a strong member of the United Nations based on also developing a strong society at home built on the principles of human rights and rule of law and good governance. This, I think, is more and more a contribution to international security. In a way, borders between national and international have disappeared. Building a good, strong nation is not only good for our own citizens, it's also a contribution to stability and security and prosperity at home, but also a basis for peace and stability in regions. We notice in the United Nations how country after country implodes, explodes, partly because of tensions inside countries. Therefore, building a good and strong society is the best contribution one can make to international peace and security, in my view. I would also like to turn it around and say that in today's international environment, in the globalized world in which we live, the good international solution, the good international formula is a national interest. Think of that. Because in the past we saw a distinction, almost a contradiction between the national and international. But if you look at issues like climate change, migration challenges, international organized crime, terrorism, these cannot be dealt with on a national level. They have to be dealt with on the global level. And if we get those formulas, then, and negotiated in a good way, with taking into account all interests, then we also have a contribution to our own national security and national interest. So I would suggest that we should think in terms of the national and international distinction being much less than we used to think of in the past, which doesn't mean that the nation state still is the basic actor. But the nation state is under pressure The beginning of my speech here will be that we live in a period of turmoil, turbulence, and in very troubled times. I have a long experience in international affairs and national affairs, and I don't think that I can recall a period with more uncertainty and more new factors that are being part of the global landscape. And I ask myself, and I ask you, to what degree we have integrated these factors in our analysis and how prepared we are to strengthen not only international institutions like United Nations, but also how national institutions can deliver better. Because if national institutions and international institutions do not deliver, we could have a crisis of confidence. Because people today know what they want. They have the knowledge in their fingers, pushing a couple of buttons and the world is there, and the information is available to all. That was not the case 20, 30 years ago, as recently as 20, 30 years ago. So we live in a new world, and we have to adapt this world to these new global trends. And I think it's urgent, because there is a sense of not only uncertainty, but also fear. There's a fear factor in today's world, not least stemming from the horrible brutality that is exercised by extremist movements now. It seems almost like there is a competition in brutality, and that fear is the method of getting the societies, the democratic societies, to not be as strong as we want them to be. I see much of the action from terrorist groups as a provocation against what we stand for, against the principles on which our societies are built, and I would say on the principles of this charter that I always carry in the pocket. This is my 12th version of it. No, the same version, of course, the same text, but the 12th text here. And I think very inspiring reading. If you need anything to be inspired by, read the preamble of this charter, read the first chapter, and you'll recognize what we wanted to do after this horrible war that ended 1945, also 70 years ago, also the birth of the United Nations. So we have to remember that when this period of pressure and tensions feels very strong, that's the time to really rally around the principles on which we built decent societies and a strong United Nations. But we have a long way to go, and it's a difficult task. Let me just enumerate in rubric form, heading form, because otherwise you would have me here standing for 3 hours. What are the elements in the new global landscape? I'll just enumerate them. It would require an academic seminar for each of them, but I will just mention what I think is new. And if you think about it, even new as related to even the 80s, the 1980s, or even 90s. The first one is the new geopolitical and geoeconomic landscape. You know it all. We speak all about the shift to the east, to Asia, the emerging economies, which I would consider rather emerging powers. That shift is obvious, and we feel it also in the United Nations, not least in the impatience by some of those emerging powers who are not members of the Security Council and who do not think that they have enough influence in the IMF or the World Bank. So one first shift is the new geopolitical, geoeconomic situation, which we have to take into account. Second is, of course, the fact that we in this room, are the first ones who really seriously have to think about the future for human beings on this planet. That never occurred to anyone in human history before, that their children and grandchildren could be living under threatened circumstances. We may have plan B in life, but there is certainly no planet B. So we have no choice. Everything we do today has to be based on the principle of sustainability. Sustainability in the environmental sense, yes, but also sustainability in the social and economic sense. This was a breakthrough conceptually in the Rio Conference 2012, these 3 dimensions of sustainability. That's the second new feature, which was not a feature as latest in the 80s. My parents didn't even know the term climate change. Maybe the young generation's parents know. A third change I already alluded to, and that is the explosion of information and communication. The fact that you can immediately get the images and get the messages out, mobilize 250,000 people in half an hour. Back when I was working with disasters in the UN in the 90s, when I went to the villages in Africa or in the suburbs of the town cities in the Middle East, people really didn't know what was going on. Now the knowledge is available. Expectations are high, and we live in a day and age of instant gratification. People want to see results immediately, not always wanting to wait for elections. Expectations are very high. You better deliver. And the number of cell phones are a telling number, isn't it? 6 billion cell phones in the world now, mobile phones. I'm tempted to compare that to something in which I'm very involved, namely water and sanitation. There are only 4.5 billion toilets. Compare those two figures, and you see the poverty, which is very, very strong inside nations. And that reality we forget, but we have an enormous speed in the communications world. Attention, which could be good, but also bad. What else is new? Well, I would say some trends are perhaps not new, but certainly much stronger than they were 20, 30 years ago. Migration. 250 million people at least in this world live in countries where they are not born. We have to see this as a positive, in my view. Cultures are exchanged, people are spreading, knowledge we are mirroring, as I said earlier, the fact that our countries are both parts of the world, but the world is also part of our countries. They will be important for the labor market. They will be important for development. Remittances of money from migrant workers is far bigger than the official development assistance in the world. It's very controversial in some countries. In Europe, there is a huge debate on immigration, and especially if you have unemployment, and youth unemployment is a big problem, then immigration can, by some political circles, be seen as a huge threat, and you divide people inside countries in us and them. And that is really a politically dangerous factor. Another such growing factor, not new but stronger, is urbanization. People don't live as they did only 50 years ago in the countryside. We have a huge and massive movement from countryside to cities. 50% of humanity live in urban areas. By 2030, it could be up to 70%. And can you imagine the changes and the effects culturally, socially, politically, economically, stress on infrastructure, particularly in an area that I follow, as I said, water and sanitation, transportation methods and so forth, but also the political, social, psychological effects. Another negative trend, no, it's not a negative trend, this is a fact of life, but a negative trend is the role of organized crime. It is cropping up in so many areas that I follow at the UN. The role of organized crime in drugs trade, in illegal arms trade, in prostitution rings, human trafficking, and the money, I can't even tell you, it's just horrible figures. And now there is a tendency in certain situations that these groups are cooperating with terrorism. We see it particularly in Africa and the Middle East right now. In order not to make you completely depressed, there are some good news also. And I think the best news, and I don't try to ingratiate myself with half of the people in this room, but I think this is finally the century of women. That historically is going to be the most important change in my view. Women have in history always had the second-class role, and this century is the century of empowerment for women. I am absolutely sure. It's bound to happen, and it must happen. It should happen. And it will be a tremendously positive force. I have mediated in 6 conflicts. I've never seen a woman on the other side of the table. And I see the women paying the price for bad water and bad sanitation. And I see women being discriminated in terms of human rights. And the trend is strong now. It will happen, and it should happen. And I think the fact that the resistance is now stronger is a sign that now it's getting serious. So here's good news. And I don't think it should be considered good news for women only. It's good news for all. I used to work for the Prime Minister of Sweden, Olof Palme, and this was long ago, so he was ahead of his time. A speechwriter came in with a draft speech to him, and he had the title, The Importance of Emancipation of Women. So Palme said, listen, you haven't understood what this is all about. It's not emancipation of women, this is emancipation of man. We all gain from this. So, I could continue with a few other new phenomena also, but I'll mention this as elements of the new global landscape. And I ask myself, to what degree are we really prepared for these global changes? I think on some of these aspects that I mentioned, yes, but not on all. And I think this, in fact, the way we deal with these challenges that I enumerated, plus the ones that you probably think of yourself, in my view, will determine whether we can meet the test of multilateralism and the test of national institutions that the world is seeing right now. We have to be able to deliver solutions for these issues and be taking into account both the fact that you need national action and even local action, I would say, and international action in an integrated fashion. So we have a period of test of institutions, nationally and internationally. What we need to work with, basically in the UN, I think, are 2 things. One is related to my comment about how national and international are integrated. The first thing is, in my view, that we need to think and work in organizations, both in the national and international scene. We need to work more horizontally and less vertically. Our organization of government, as I know from my own case in Sweden, and the United Nations is along silos, unfortunately. I have the greatest respect for the silo, because you have to have the best professionals in each silo. You have to be a good lawyer, a good economist, a good public administrator, etc., etc., engineer. But when you need to go to the solving of the problems, you have to go horizontal and bring in others. And unfortunately, there is a turf character, that this is my area, don't you interfere in my area. Shamshad and I talked about that yesterday. It's very damaging, not only for the others on the outside, it's also damaging for your own organization. I claim that it's only when you work together horizontally that you can achieve results. So it's actually in the interest of the silo to work horizontally. And by the way, since I've tried to apply this both in the UN and at home, it's more fun. You learn a lot. You get completely different perspectives on the issues. You put the problem in the center, and why not a glass of water, which is lacking for 748 million people. And then you ask who can do something about it. And then you reach in the end some type of division of labor. The second thing that I think the United Nations need to do, and we need to reform definitely like all institutions, we need finally to be serious about prevention. I feel in my job as mediator and humanitarian emergency relief coordinator as I've been, and out in the field, I feel like I'm the fireman who comes after the fire has ended and we pick up the pieces. I would like to be there when the smoke develops. In the best of cases, I will be there when the arsonist reaches for the match. We need to pick up the first signals in the ground. The human rights violations, the discrimination of different groups, the drought that will lead to higher food prices 6 months later, All these things to just think ahead. It seems like in human nature, we don't want to see problems until the problem becomes critical. The more we can act preventively, and I say that particularly the young people in this room, if you can introduce models of prevention, we could save so many lives. We could save so much money. We could save so much night sleep and the reputation of our organizations. I often draw a line, I can't do that. If I were visiting Professor in Uppsala, as I was 2008 and 9, after I left Foreign Ministry, I would have drawn a line, but I'll do it like this instead. This is the line, the life of a conflict. But we tend to define the conflict almost like CNN here. When the houses are burning, when the children are dying, when we have to set up a humanitarian operation, when we have to set up a peacekeeping operation, Security Council meetings day and night, that's that crisis, the burning crisis area. We need to understand that crisis is here, the first vibrations, and the crisis is also after we leave. Look at Afghanistan, for instance, or Somalia. You can't leave overnight. It's like letting a triple bypass patient go to work 8 o'clock in the morning after the operation. We have to have reconciliation, we have to have setting up institutions, prepare so that we don't have a relapse into conflict. I'll just give you a few examples of activities, because this might be too theoretical what I've been saying here. When I was President of the General Assembly, I was very proud to have gavelled the formula in the declaration of 16th of September 2005, where it said, we say in that preamble, there is no peace without development, and there is no development without peace, and none of the above without respect of human rights and the rule of law. These are three pillars on which the United Nations work is built, but also, in my view, of what a nation needs to do. If one of these pillars is weak, the whole structure is weak. We have to work with them at the same time, which is another reason why we have to work horizontally and bring in the development factors in the war, in the peace and security issues, vice versa, and see that human rights violations are also a factor both for peace and security and development. And, of course, rule of law, anti-corruption, as I talked with some of you before the meeting. So in these areas, what are our challenges? I just have to give you a couple of examples, because otherwise it would go far too long. In the peace and security, the biggest issue for us now is to get peace in Syria. This has been an enormously frustrating experience to have wonderful, very skilled negotiators like Kofi Annan and Lakhdar Brahimi and Staffan de Mistura. They have not been given the tools to really do the work that they want to do and could do. There is no unified line in the Security Council. We have now had 4 years of war. I don't need to repeat to you the horrors. I've been seeing it myself, particularly from the neighboring countries' perspective. And in a couple of months, we will have 3 years since Kofi Annan produced a formula which I think still is applicable for the solution of this problem, namely the communique that was negotiated on the 30th of June 2012, requesting that a transitional body, a governing body, is created with full executive powers. Secretary General and I have talked about this, and we want very much now to activate efforts to reach a political solution. It's good to get the Aleppo freeze and de-escalation, but we have to have a political process. As, by the way, we also need now in Yemen, which is a conflict that could easily grow into a very serious situation. I think I will leave it like that so that you have time for questions. On the development side, I would want to be on record for saying that the key issue now is the formulation of the Sustainable Development Goals. The Millennium Development Goals, established 2000, 2015, have been a very useful tool for development. Now we have a new set of goals, more transformative, reaching into new sectors that were not covered back in 2000. It's going to be more complicated machinery for the implementation of these goals, but they will reflect the road that we need to choose for this period, 2015 to 30. Based on the principle of universality, that we all in this world are interdependent, it's not developing countries, particularly when it comes to sustainability, it's equally a burden or an obligation for the member states. We need to think of inequalities. Unfortunately, there are more poor people in today's world living in middle-income countries than in poor countries. So this is a challenge also for middle-income countries. But I am hopeful that we will have a good set of goals, and we have high-level attendance assured for the end of September. But there is one very important meeting before that, where we don't have the assured attendance on the highest level, and perhaps also need for further work on the substance, and that is the financing for development. We need to make sure that there's also means of implementation of these goals, and particularly from the countries in the developing world, G77 as we call it in the UN, there is a request that we work harder on those means of implementation in the financial field. That meeting in July is crucial, I think also for the success of the meeting in September. And then we have the meeting at the end of the year, by the way, which is absolutely crucial and which is Ban Ki-moon's, I would say its highest priority, namely success on the climate change negotiation. So we have a sequence of the Addis conference in July, and the New York conference in September, and the Paris conference in December. And this is not just bureaucracy, it's lots of substance involved in all these three elements. By the way, let me say, there is a written speech available, and Anne-Marie Slott-Carlson will make that available for those who are interested, which mainly will cover what I've been saying. But I can't assure that it's phrased in the same way. So if you want documentation, something will be left behind. The last point is, of course, human rights. And that is where I think we need to do more, because the human rights dimension relates to the first three words of this charter. You all know what the first three words are, don't you? We the peoples. We are here to serve the people of the world. We owe them serious work on peace, serious work on development, and serious work on human rights and rule of law. And we have to understand that in the end it's a question of making sure that people in the world can live lives of dignity, and that we have an organization that can do the job if you, member states, you, all generations, support these basic ideas in this time and age when we are under such great pressures and where there is so much uncertainty. I think this organization, this charter, represents the most important word right now for us, and that is hope. The hope is in this organization, but it is also in women, it is in young people like you who have dreams and aspirations that you should never give up. It is in science and knowledge, information, that could do so much difference on the environmental field and the health field. And it is in this organization. Even if I'm a friend of the UN, I'm not an uncritical friend, but I say to my colleagues, and you have heard it before, those who are traveling with me, United Nations is a reflection of two things. We are a reflection of the world as it is, and it's not a pretty place. We need to be very firm in our analysis, no rosy eyeglasses. We are a reflection of the world as it is, but we are also a reflection, a mirror of the world as it should be. The difference is our job. The world as it is, we must know, but we must never forget the world as it should be. I don't ask you or anyone to close the gap. That would be putting us under too high expectations. I only ask you to try your best to diminish it, reduce it a little bit. And I say, nobody can do everything, but everybody can do something. And let's go to work on that basis. By that, I thank you very much for your attention, that I have gone completely out of the manuscript, but it comes at least from my own heart. So thank you very much for inviting me, and I'm ready to stay for another 20 minutes. I just already passed on a word that I'm going to be 50 minutes late for the next meeting, because I want to also hear from you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for an inspiring and very passionate lecture. I know that many of you from our audience are now eager to ask questions, and there are 2 volunteers with microphones, so if you raise your hand, then I can provide the microphone, and then we'll receive and we'll collect questions. And please ask your question in English, and I would appreciate brevity and clarity. Okay, so in one round, let's collect 2 questions at a time. Here, and then anybody else? Okay, let's start here.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Secretary General. My name is Dong-hyun Kim. I study English literature and political science in Korea University. First of all, as a constituent of the United Nations, I want to thank for your service for the United Nations and for the people of the entire world. If I remember correctly, Honor Toynbee, he said, human repeat history every 1 decade. After peace process, there comes a war. After war, there comes a peace process. Thinking of Napoleonic War, and then there comes a Vienna Convention. Thinking of World War I and II, there comes the United Nations. So my question will be, what is your vision of history? And in regards to, and also I want you to share your views of the United Nations and its role in terms of your vision in the history as well. Thank you.
I think I could take a couple of others if there are anyone else. That's a pretty big question.
Okay.
There's one in the middle of the row here. You got the microphone?
Hi. Oh, okay. So, first of all, thank you for your inspiring speech. And I'm a freshman in Korean University studying French literature, and very interested in international issues and conflicts. So, if I remember correctly, you mentioned pursuing national interests will lead us to reaching international prosperity. And when it comes to political or economical issues, could pursuing national interest still be an effective way of reaching international prosperity?
Anyone else? Otherwise, I'll go at this and you may think of other questions. When you said the word vision, I was thinking of the second Secretary General of the United Nations. His name is Dag Hammarskjöld. He was Secretary General between 1953 and 61. When he died, he left behind his reflections on his work and his life. And he defined in one of his markings, which they're called waymarks, what he considered a reflection of the future. And he said the future is 2 things. The future is the vision. The future is the horizon. He was a man of nature also. The future is the horizon. The future is the vision. But, and here it comes to try to answer your question, the future is also the step you take tomorrow. And there has to be a connection between the step that you take tomorrow and the vision that you set for yourself. The vision, in my view, is in this charter. Again, read the preamble, read the first chapter, and you see what it is. That facilitates a lot of decisions in my daily life. The fact that you can try to make the steps be in the direction of your vision. Otherwise, you run around in circles. And having these principles are very important. Now to the question what the United Nations has done. I would say it's extremely important now when the UN has its 70th anniversary and when member states are celebrating 70 years since the war ended, to be looking back, draw lessons, and then take that with you as an energy in the road ahead. And for the United Nations, even if we were extremely disappointed after 1945 that the Cold War was like a wet blanket over the world affairs, there was a lot of things that happened. The most important is, of course, the decolonization. The fact that the member states of the UN back in the 50s were between 50 and 60, now 192, is a reflection of the freedom that have been achieved for so many, finally. And then you have the different treaties which are sometimes now disputed and controversial, but we have next week or two, we have the Non-Proliferation Treaty on the nuclear proliferation issue, the mass destruction weapons. There have been progress in rule of law and institution building, anti-corruption measures. There have been standard sets, UN as a norm setting. And then I also, when I'm out in the field, I think of what the UN is doing. When I see children being vaccinated, when I see people get clean water, when I see health clinics being built, and when I see my humanitarian workers working in Syria and other situations, or our peacekeepers, in 116,000 in 17 operations right now. The work out there in the field is so meaningful. I think we can be proud of that. But I still think, if you go back to my speech, that we need to look at this new landscape and ask ourselves, to what degree are we prepared to deal with these new trends? How meaningful are our activities for people in that global landscape? With these new and ethnic and religious factors exacerbating conflicts, with the great youth unemployment, which is a fertile soil for extremist ideologies, etc. And how do we make sure that we get the power from the women? How do we use the fact that people are moving in such a way that it is seen as a positive? All these challenges we need to be on top of the analysis, but not only internationally, but also nationally. The national efforts have to come together, and that brings me to the second question. My point is actually this one, that anyone who works in the national context has to have an international perspective. Any nation that aspires to play a global role has to have a global dimension in its policies. Looking inward and saying that this is ours and that is the outside world, it might be the comfortable road to take in the short run when the country is under huge pressures from the outside, trade-wise or immigration. But that is a short-term approach. The long-term approach is to see it as a fact of life that we live in a globalized world, and that globalized world has to be reflected in the nations. And we should then convince, in my view, and it's not too hard, that the global solutions, climate change is the most convincing one, or any of the global challenges need an international formula. You can't, by definition, solve anything related, for instance, to migration. It's by definition international. And that problem, or that challenge, is a problem at home. That means that the international reflex, international action, is part of the national interest. So it's a somewhat convoluted way of saying that, yes, the nation state is the main actor, but the most vital, the strongest nation state is one that works well to create strong society at home, but also has a global perspective. That is what I meant, and I'm glad you asked that question so I could clarify that.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions? Yes.
There's one up there.
One here and one in the center. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you for your inspiring speech. I am a sophomore majoring in French language and literature, and I just wanted to ask about your stance on the reform of the Security Council, because it is one of the only organs of the UN that has legally binding power, but there were very much controversy regarding its expansion of membership or the veto powers that the P5 nations manipulate to pursue their own national interests. So regarding those controversies, I was curious about how you thought about the reform of the SC. So, yeah.
I saw one up
Yeah, one more question.
Hi, my name is Yeon Kim. I'm currently studying in Korea University as a sophomore, majoring in political science. And before going on, I'm very honored to directly ask you the questions I'm really curious about. So during the overall lecture you mentioned, I could see that you especially emphasized that there's less boundaries between national interest and international interest currently than before. And then I have this coming up question about especially East Asian society, because unlike decades ago, currently there are uprising of Japan, South Korea, and currently China's empowering powers and developmental states and all. And I believe that the roles of those national states, especially in terms of groups, are like similar to beforehands of EU or some Western states, is quite different from those of before, because the very basic principle of those countries are quite different as well, such as Confucianism and so on. So, and I thought that those kind of powers, nations, are basically based on the economic growth and the national interest rather than international states' interest. So in terms of this kind of view, I thought, I wondered about your opinion about how East Asian groups and nations should focus on the international interest that could be different from the beforehand of the Western states. Thank you for listening.
Now it's getting serious.
One more? Okay. No one more? Okay. Okay, I'll go for these two then. Security Council reform. I was president. Did a lot of reforms 2005 and 6, but I must admit the most difficult negotiation was on the Security Council issue. Because the Security Council issue is an issue of national interest in terms of really even limited security interest or isolated security interests. If one member state enters the Security Council with veto rights or as a permanent member, you have immediate reactions from countries, often in the neighborhood, who see that they should have that role and that this gives an exclusive right for the country that would enter to play a much bigger role on the international scene. This is probably the reason why it's so difficult to get the enlargement to the Council. I would also say that the interest among the permanent members of the Security Council is limited, if I may be diplomatic, on this issue. An expansion of the Security Council, which is requested by a number of countries, would require a revision of the Charter. So it's a very difficult process. What is being discussed very much in New York among member states and now in the General Assembly is to what degree one could see the veto right being more limited. The veto right has been used, according to many, far too generously, too often, or the threat of a veto. And by the way, that is, of course, one of the reasons why we haven't seen progress on the Syria issue that I mentioned earlier, and not to speak about Ukraine. The French government came up with a proposal last year to limit the use of the veto, that it cannot be used in situations of mass atrocities, ethnic cleansing, genocide, and so forth. This is being discussed among council members, permanent members, and I don't know whether the French are making progress, but I see it as an interesting sign that there is an awareness that the council needs to be reformed. Also, many countries, of course, claim that the Security Council does not reflect the world as it is today in that new global landscape. It is formed along the lines of 1945 and 1962 when it was expanded. So that issue is coming up all the time, and it has also to do with what I said earlier, the emerging powers role. And not also the shift to the east, by the way. So the Security Council members have to think about this also in terms of respect and legitimacy of the Council. For me, as a now international civil servant, I have limited role on this. This is now a member state issue. I could have spoken much freely about it if I were the Foreign Minister of Sweden, but that I am not anymore. I have a joke here. I'm taking risks here. When I was President of the General Assembly, I had lunch with the 5 permanent members, and I claimed that they should use the Security Council more for negotiations Why threaten with a veto, or why cast the veto before you have really tested whether you can negotiate a resolution? You should see that you have a tremendous gift in your hand that the member states are giving you. You are given the chance to put in a veto. And you have the permanent membership in the Council, which has the most deciding power in the UN. Why don't you really sit and negotiate, especially after the Cold War was over? At that time we considered the Cold War over. I hope it is. And then I said, it came to me, I said, why don't you work like the Catholic Church when they select popes? You know, you lock them up, and then the cardinals, only when the white smoke comes out, you've done the job. I say this, the serious background to that joke is that I think we could, for instance, have tried harder, or they could have tried harder to give us a resolution, give Kofi Annan, Dr. Brahimi, and Staffan de Mistura a stronger resolution by not giving up the chance to find common ground for a solution. Okay. Well, you asked me a big question, and I have lunch in 35 minutes. And I would not dare interfere in this enormously sensitive issue, but I would just generally say that every nation wins from developing a peaceful relationship to their neighbors. I often am asked about Sweden's progress. There are many reasons, but one reason is, in fact, that the 5 Nordic countries are like brothers and sisters, completely integrating, proud of our own national identities. Are there any Nordic ambassadors here today? No? Yeah, there you are. Very tight, complete integration of legislation, almost all language identity same, except in Finland. You know, crossing to a border in the Nordic countries is really a joy. You know, when I crossed borders in Darfur, where I was mediating, or in Horn of Africa, Somalia, Ethiopia, it was almost a danger for my life in certain situations. When I crossed into the Sagawi territory in Chad from Darfur. But when we cross, you know, we have go skiing in Norway, or have good food in Denmark, and crayfish party in Finland, and I don't know what they like in Sweden, but they come. So here is, I think the fact, and also European integration, I would say, even if they have a tough time now, I think the European countries are basing their security on cooperation and making war absolutely impossible in Europe. I don't think that war is possible among the members of the European Union. This is, I think, the vision, but then you have that horizon of Hammarskjöld and the roads to go there. And of course you have different interests, but I would say that one should try to identify the factors that unite and the factors that can build peace in the future, the factors that can build prosperity, because since they are all related, prosperity will also be part of the equation. And of course you have, as much as possible, to try to develop a common value base. And there you have, of course, different traditions that are divisive, certainly. But the more identity of analysis of the future you have in peace, security, development, human rights and rule of law, the stronger the prospects are for peace, and the better the prospects are for prosperity, and the better the prospects are for life and dignity for all. Was that too diplomatic? Okay. I think I can take one more.
Last question, and you can now take pictures. Okay. Any last question or two? All right.
Very
One
last
question
row.
at the end. All right.
You will have a short answer, I hope.
Hello, my name is Myung-Ah Park, and I'm a graduate student in law school. And I'm curious that what is the opinion of your what is the opinion of sexual prostitution?
I don't understand. The opinion of?
Sexual prostitution. Yes. And these days in Korea, there is some issue that is it constitutional to legalize to punish both victim and suspect of sexual prostitution. And I read some Palermo Protocol, and that the visions of UN is to punish and prevent the human trafficking. But there is some women that their opinion is some women have the right to sell their some sexual prostitution. So I'm curious about your opinion.
Well, I need more time to answer that in correctly and adequately. But I think we need to focus on both sexual violence in itself and on trafficking and prostitution. It's part also of organized crime, and it's clearly related to basic human rights. And I think we need to be extremely firm on both these counts, both the sexual violence in general, which is massive. It's used as a tool of war. I've seen it in several conflicts recently, but also on the prostitution. Sweden took, I'll come back to my Swedish background now, we took a very drastic step about 10 years ago when buying a woman, buying sex, so to speak, was considered a crime. It wasn't the victim that was primarily focused, it was on those who took advantage of that market, so to speak. But I think when you look around the world today and see that millions of girls and young boys also, by the way, and women are trafficked as merchandise is a shame. And if you add to that the number of people that are sold in labor, you probably add up to 10 million people who are being traded as merchandise. And I think it's a complete divorce from human dignity. So we should always count to what degree we stand up for principles by looking at how the most vulnerable are treated. One of the prime ministers I worked for said he had a very simple definition of a good society. He said a good society is a good society who looks at the most vulnerable. How are the most vulnerable treated? The poorest, the disabled, the prostitutes, the abandoned children, how are they treated? That was to him the quality test of a good society. On a good note, on a positive note, I would just like to say to you, I heard several of you were in the humanistic area, literature, French, and so forth. And I just want to tell, my last story is about Hammarskjöld again. He was a man of culture. He loved to read. He was interpreter. He was translating French poetry. He was sitting with philosophers. When he was Secretary General, and he was a photographer, his life was culture at the same time as he was Secretary General. And many people asked, how could he be Secretary General and spend all that time in culture? Culture was to him what gave him the energy and the inspiration and the new perspectives on his work. And I can give you an example. He invited people to dinner in his home in New York, and when they came, 10 people guests, he said, I want you to not say a word tonight when we have dinner. I want you to listen to Bach and listen to Handel. I have a new record. And he had this played in the dining room. And they were sitting, having dinner for 2-3 hours and listening to this fantastic music. And then in the evening, seriously, he came up to each and everybody and said, didn't we have a wonderful time together? So this means that I inspire you to, I really ask you to continue your humanistic studies, because that has to do with the respect for culture and history and traditions, which to me as a mediator has been perhaps the most important lesson, that showing respect for the other side's culture, history and tradition is absolutely crucial. Not from a perspective of my own interest, but also from the perspective of having a more interesting life. So good luck in your studies, and you will probably connect it to some type of political or economic or social activity, but it will help you in the future. Think of Hammarskjöld. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to ask Anne-Marie Slot-Carlson, who is the director of the UNDP Seoul Policy Center here, to say some final words.
And I promise I won't be long. You have a very busy schedule, Mr. Eliasson. I just want to thank you for joining us, for painting this bigger picture, for reminding us that we do have a foundation, we do have the charter, we do have the vision, and we also then need to know if we have an organization that can do the job. We're in Korea. The Korean popular support for the UN is bigger than anywhere in the world. I think it was even the case before Ban Ki-moon became Secretary General. This is very important for us also, for my center, UNDP Seoul Policy Center, to know that this support is there. And I think, Mr. Eliasson, you also felt the questions from the students, so we were very confident that we could do this lecture, and we were so happy that the partners of the UNDP Seoul Policy Center could be here with us. And I just want to say that we will do this again. Anytime we get an opportunity, we would like to give these lectures like I do myself, but on a much smaller scale than you. So please come again, or have other high-level UN officials coming. And thank you so much. I think the lecture will be out on TV. It's being recorded. So it will be available for more people to see. It will be there for posterity. Thank you so much, and please come again. Oh.
Okay, I'd like to make a few practical announcements about exiting. Due to security concerns, I'd appreciate it if all of you in the audience remain seated until our special guest and Mr. Eliasson has left the room. Okay.